Great.
All right.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. Even though I can't see you, for joining us today to talk about FDA inspections and how you can prepare. And so, as the slide says, my name is Roxanne Pritchard. I am with the MCW HRPP. I'm with Quality Assurance, Quality Improvement. And so I'll share a little bit of information with you about preparing. It sounds kind of like a wisecrack, but the best way to prepare for an audit is before you even start the study. And nobody, including myself, would ever think of preparing before I even start my study. But that would be the gold standard. Having said that, we'll go through the slides and find what you can do if you didn't start preparing before the study. So hopefully, oops, come on, there we go. So hopefully what I'll be able to do today is cover a couple of different pieces of information. Why do FDA audits occur in the first place? Is it just to antagonize you and to increase your stress level, or is there another reason behind it? And what to do when you get that phone call, what to expect during an inspection, and then things to take care of after the inspection. And you'll probably notice that I utilize the term audit and inspections interchangeably. Some people like to use the word audit. For me, it just increases my stress level when I use that. So I try to use the word inspection, but you will probably hear me say audit at least 10 times in the next hour. So I just got a prompt to join the audio.
Oh.
You can do a
Actually just X out of it.
okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Okay. Technical issues. Thank God Sarah is right next to me. Okay, so back in 1977, as this slide says, the FDA established the Bioresearch Monitoring Program. And there were, three main purposes for that program: to ensure the protection of the rights, safety, and welfare of the participants in an FDA-regulated clinical trial, to be able to verify the accuracy and reliability of the data that has been submitted to the FDA in support of a marketing application, and to assess the compliance with statutory requirements and FDA regulations regarding the conduct of the clinical study, informed consent, ethical review. The most common reasons for FDA inspections are to validate the accuracy of the clinical trial data, to ensure human subject protection at the site as they participated in the study, to validate the proper handling of investigational product, and in some cases, to respond to a concern or a complaint that has been filed with the FDA. The FDA may conduct an inspection for a variety of reasons. The inspections themselves can be scheduled and announced or unannounced. No matter whether it's a for-cause inspection or a routine inspection, announced or unannounced, the process is going to be pretty much the same. The inspector is going to ask questions and request documentation to better understand the overall structure within the institution regarding the conduct of the study and the oversight of the study. So I found some metrics on the FDA's website. And back in I should start to tell you first that clinical investigators and the conduct of studies by those research teams are not the only focus for FDA inspections. inspectors will come and inspect an IRB, a sponsor, manufacturing, plants and industry, as well as those clinical inspectors conducting those studies at their sites. The majority of inspections are focusing on investigators and the conduct of their studies at the site. But just to let you know, it's not 100% focus. So, as I started to say a few minutes ago, I found some metrics on the FDA website, and back in fiscal year 2022, of the inspections of clinical investigators and the conduct of studies at their sites, 22% of those inspections had findings of noncompliance. And so there was noncompliance regarding the conduct
Oh my
of the
God.
study.
I need to just.
There's somebody not muted, I'm trying to find. Just wanna remind everybody to keep yourself muted.
Another focus or another finding that was found back in fiscal year 22, there was a lack of accurate or adequate case history. So it's that, that documentation supporting why someone was eligible or supporting their activities and outcome while they're participating in the research study. Another finding was concerning accountability records for investigational products. The IRB oversight, failure to report adverse events to a sponsor promptly, and other findings were concerning the consenting process, either certain elements that are required in the consent form were not included in the consent form, or there were issues with the consenting process, not being provided in an understandable language, not having signed consent forms and dated by the participants, or a copy of the consent form provided to them. So a number of findings, none of them should sound too outrageous. I think we encounter them all. And so it's basically the challenge of how to better prepare yourself to not have those findings when an FDA inspector gives you a call. So as I mentioned, there are different types of inspections. There's pre-approval audits, post-approval, surveillance audits, and for-cause audits. So once again, the process is going to be pretty much the same in all of these types of audits. It's interviewing, it's review of documentation, it's using the same forms. The inspector is going to use the same forms to gather the information and jot down their findings and impressions, whether it's a routine audit or a for-cause audit. So trying to keep the process as standardized as possible. There are a variety of reasons that a site might be selected for an FDA audit. And some of the reasons are listed here on this slide. So a sponsor might have just submitted their application for marketing approval. Your site could be a high enrolling site, or the number of adverse events or protocol deviations that have been reported by this site might be significantly higher or lower as compared to other sites conducting the same study. There could have been a lapse in IRB approval and research activities took place when you didn't have IRB approval. Perhaps there was an issue where the sponsor needed to suspend the conduct of the study or terminate the study at the site. Or the FDA received a complaint about the study. In the event that there had been previous inspections of this study or at this site or of this investigator, depending on those findings, particularly if they required written corrective action response, that might be another reason that your site, your study could be selected. So because FDA regulated studies are now conducted worldwide, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, which is just one of the centers within the FDA that is part of the BMO program, they developed a tool to collect data regarding the various sites that are conducting a particular study, and they use this tool to analyze the information and identify the sites that should be selected for a review. So the data that's going into this tool is very similar to what you're seeing on this slide. But there might be a few more data points that are being collected. So what was the number of individuals that were screened for the study as compared to how many were consented and enrolled? How many withdrew? Certainly, the number of protocol deviations, adverse events will play a part in this analysis. But then sites will be able to be identified. So if an investigator is conducting a study at a site and that site has never had an FDA inspection, or that investigator has never had an FDA inspection, there probably is a little bit greater likelihood that they might be selected for an inspection. And particularly for if your sponsor has just submitted an application for marketing approval. And Sharon, you have a question?
Yes, could your site also be inspected if the sponsor was being inspected, not in particular the PI or your site, but as part of the overall audit or inspection?
Sure, and I think you're describing a situation where the study's closed, right? So the sponsor, once again, submitting their application for marketing approval, the FDA is going to look at their data. But then the FDA has an obligation to look at a number of sites that were conducting that study to be able to compare what is the data that we have at the site? How does it relate to the data that's with the sponsor? Can we see that it all aligns, or are there discrepancies here, right? And so they start, whether they start at the sponsor or start at a site, I don't know how that decision is made, but definitely,
Thank you.
can look at both. Thanks. Great question. So this slide is just to remind us all that during an FDA inspection, there are a number of federal regulations that may apply. So whether it's a drug, biologic device, we have particular regulations that are in place concerning those activities. There are a separate set of regulations concerning the consenting process and involvement of vulnerable populations, pregnant women, fetuses, children, prisoners. There are regulations concerning financial disclosure by the clinical investigator. This is something else that might be looked at by the inspector during an audit. The IRB review, wanting to make certain that the IRB has reviewed everything that is being conducted and that there truly is an IRB of record, as well as electronic systems, looking at electronic records and signatures. And then, of course, clinical trial registration on ct.gov. Now, if your study is an investigator-initiated clinical trial where your investigator is also the sponsor, there are going to be additional regulations that are going to apply. If the study is being conducted at the VA, guess what? There are even more regulations that will apply. But this is just to kind of remind you that there are a number of regulations, and those are the rulers that the inspector is comparing your information against. And just a reminder that the FDA has adopted ICH GCP E6 and recognizes that it's a should, it's not a must. Regulations are musts. The guidances are shoulds, but you need a really good reason why you didn't do something that was listed as a should. So just to remind you about that. So this slide is to help us understand just what exactly is included in an FDA inspection, and I think I've touched on some of this already. So the inspection will involve the evaluation of the PI's practices and procedures to determine compliance with all of the applicable regulations. You all know that the PI is ultimately responsible for the entire conduct of the study, but the PI is not going to be doing it all and then should be supervising. So how is that PI supervising and how are they checking in? Once again, if a marketing application has been submitted, there's going to be the comparison of the data that's submitted to the FDA, and it's being compared against your source documents, your research data that has been entered into that data capture system. And then for surveillance inspections or for cause inspections, the inspector may not have access to some of the data that lies within that data capture system. So they're looking at the documentation of what's happening here at this site, right? And their interviews are concerning those activities. I've provided this slide just to, once again, think about documentation. At the beginning, I said the best time to begin preparing is before you start a study. So just thinking about the various documents that are within a regulatory file, all of those are eligible for review by the inspector and most likely will all be reviewed by the inspector. The inspector may also ask for a list of studies that are currently being conducted by that PI whose study is being investigated or studies are being investigated, or any studies that were conducted within the past 5 years. And so this obviously is just limited to FDA regulated studies. So it's not FDA regulated, you don't need to share that, but they may ask for a list and you would need to be able to provide that. So I include this slide just to, ask, do you know where all these documents are? Can you access them? Are they complete? Are they current? Yeah. Are there any discrepancies of information? You want to be kind of thinking about that, and hopefully you have a process in place to try to minimize any of those concerns. There's even more documentation that the inspectors will look at, and that includes documentation of the conduct of the study. So it starts at recruitment process. How were people recruited? What was approved for recruitment purposes? How was consent obtained? Was it, do we see that there is documentation of the consenting process where information was described to the individual, their questions were answered, and they ended up saying, I understand, they'd still like to proceed. Was information provided in an understandable fashion? If witnesses were required, what was the situation? How is that being documented? And then, of course, you know, if assent was being obtained in addition or, I would say in addition to consent, how was that being obtained? How is that documented? How is the study being conducted? Does the documentation illustrate that the study was conducted in accordance with the IRB approved protocol, or are there deviations? Were there exceptions that were granted by the sponsor? What did the eligibility look like? Was all of the inclusion criteria met and none of the exclusion criteria? These are just, you know, some examples of what they're looking at. And then, as I mentioned earlier, what was the outcome with the individual's participation throughout the study? So do we see documentation of adverse events or patient-reported outcomes, whatever might be required in that protocol? And then lastly, if there were any corrections or edits that needed to be made to the initial documentation or data that has been placed into the data capture system, how is that corrected? And what's the documentation around that correction? And the inspector is going to be very interested in hearing about that process. And how did you involve your PI? Because they're going back to the premise, the PI is ultimately responsible for the entire conduct of the study. So hopefully your documentation not only is covering all of these activities, but it's also showing how you're keeping your PI updated and how your PI is making decisions regarding continuation of the study. But wait, there's more. The inspector is also going to be looking at the security and retention of research records. Are all of the records there? Are they being retained in accordance with the regulatory requirements? Are they secure? Are they with limited access only to individuals within the study team that needs to have access to them, and not to unauthorized individuals who could alter a record or remove it or destroy it or whatever it could be? And if the inspector is coming in once the study is closed, they're also looking at the retention of your records after the study is closed. And the inspector could be coming shortly after the study is closed, or maybe it's a little bit later. So what do you have for records? Is it the original documents, or has your sponsor provided an electronic copy? And how did you and your PI ensure that the information that's on that electronic copy is fully representative of all your study data? Okay, so they're going to be asking questions about that and looking into this a little bit, asking about process. And then, of course, I had mentioned electronic records and systems and electronic signatures. And so this is just, you know, a little bit of the laundry list of what Part 11 requirements apply to. The great thing is that even though our medical records at Freighter and Children's and the VA are electronic, those, the FDA does not have authority over how those records are maintained. Okay, so even though that system needs to comply with 21 Part 11, the FDA inspector is not evaluating that system. But the inspector is going to be asking about, you know, who all has access to these various systems? What's the training like? How is it kept secure? can you show me your audit trail for timestamp of the various activities? What's your recovery plan if something is lost or there's some sort of natural disaster? And many more questions. So, you may have someone from your research team available to address those, or you might actually, depending on the systems that you're using, indicate, we need someone from IT that, supports our department or division to speak to some of this. If it's the electronic case report forms, your sponsor is going to be the best person to speak to some of those questions. So just kind of recognizing who might be the best resource for that information and making certain to include them in the fun of an inspection. So when the FDA calls, don't panic, please. Even though it's probably that first inclination of, oh my God, I was just planning on taking next Monday off. It just, it is what it is, right? And hopefully you have a good system that you're already 75, 90% ready for that inspector to come to the door. But during that phone call, I want you to collect some information. Who's coming? Is that person coming by him or herself, or bringing a few business associates? When are they coming? How long are they going to be here? What kind of inspection is this? Is it routine? Is it for cause? Can you tell me why? What was the concern or complaint that you received? They're going to give you information about what studies they want to look at, which ones. Could be one, it could be multiple. The other piece of information you want to be able to secure at this time is whether that inspector is going to need access to any specific equipment or systems that you might need to make additional arrangements for, right? So once you hang up, you still can't go home. You have to start letting everyone else know that the inspector is coming. And so this is just a little bit of a list of who should be included. So that PI, definitely you want the PI there. And they need to know that, give them as much information as you've been able to obtain in that phone call. You want to notify your other research team members, including the primary contact. If you have support coming from other areas, I think of if it's a drug study, you might have your IDS person there because there could be a question for them. If some of your activities are taking place in the TRU, I would have a representative from that unit there. And this is just two examples. It's definitely not limited to that. MCW, excuse me, corporate compliance has a policy, and they want you to notify the Office of Research, Seniors Associate Team for Research, Dr. Nattinger. And if this is not a scheduled, announced inspection, and it's an unscheduled, they're at your front door today inspection, the policy states that you can notify the Senior Associate Dean for Research within 1 business day using the external audit notification form. Okay, so we recognize if this is unexpected that the FDA inspector is at your door, they haven't called you in advance. We know you're going to be busy, but within 1 business day, you need to send that notification form into Dr. Nanninger. You need to notify the IRB of record. Why? Because the IRB is here to support. The IRB is also possibly going to be asked questions about their process. And now I think, holy smokes, It's not just MCW IRB. It could be an external IRB. It could be WCG. It could be NCIC IRB. So you're notifying that IRB of record. If the IRB of record is external to us, please, please, please notify your HRPP. So what does that mean? So if you're conducting a study at Freidert, you're going to notify MCW HRPP, Dr. Spellacy, Anne Marie Eve, and me. If your study is at Children's and there were agreements to have an external IRB be the IRB of record for this FDA clinical trial, you're going to notify CW HRPP. If MCW IRB is not involved, we don't need to know about that. So you have to kind of think a little bit, you know, who are my folks and offices that are invested? Where am I conducting this study? So if you're conducting it at a community organization, so it's FDA regulated, it's there. You're going to also want to notify those officials, right? Of course, your department chair, your division chief, your program director needs to know, as well as the study sponsor. And if required in your protocol or your finalized contract, you want to also notify your research monitor and your funding agencies. Okay, so some contracts will actually specify that, others it just left for the sponsor and they'll do their other notifications. Question?
If it's a sponsor initiated study, will the FDA still just reach out to the site directly versus going to the sponsor first?
It depends.
Okay,
It depends on the reason for the inspection.
okay.
Yeah. So most of the FDA inspections that I'm aware of that happen here with our healthcare agencies, they are situations where the application has been filed for marketing approval. So the sponsor started it,
Mhm,
right?
yeah,
They submitted that paperwork. So they're already kind of contacting sites and saying, just to let you know, we submitted our application and there's a chance you could be selected for an inspection. Now, frankly, I think they tell all their sites that. If I were a sponsor, that's what I would do. That is also a great time to start preparing for an FDA inspection in case you weren't able to prepare before you started conducting your study. So that's the majority of the FDA audits that we've had here. Once in a while, we'll get a for-cause audit. And at that point, I'm not sure if the sponsor was notified initially or not. It kind of depends on the nature of the complaint or concern that was raised. Yeah, great question. Okay, so you've notified everybody and now it's time to begin preparation. You want to make certain that you have adequate space for your inspector to work. And whatever equipment they need, whatever systems they need to have access to, you want to make certain that's all available. So, you know, so in your phone call with the inspector, when they call to announce their visit, are they bringing their own laptop? Will they need data support? Will they, you know, are they old fashioned and they're just bringing a bunch of paper? What are they going to be needing? And so you want the space where the inspector is going to be working to be, you know, near your workspace. So you're not running 5 miles back and forth, but you also want them to have a little private space. So maybe they're not hearing everything that's going on outside the walls. So you have to kind of work with that a little bit. So along those lines, you want to just remind everyone who's working in that area, the inspector is coming. Let's keep our conversations concerning, business in another area that's private and secure and not in a public space, right? So even people who may not be part of the research team, they're not being notified initially, but now they're being told, oh, we're gonna have FDA inspector, be on your best behavior and have those conversations over there. Obviously, you want to make certain that you have all of the research related documentation available, that it's complete, and it is viewable. I think of some studies in the past where not only the written report needed to be viewed, but also the initial recording. So in some cases that was an image. Sometimes it was a tracing. It's like, oh, we didn't know we needed those images or that tracing anymore. I don't think we have that. Or maybe it's on a system that is so archaic. Because sometimes FDA regulated studies can go on for a very long time, right? Does the system still work? So you're just kind of checking into those things. And once again, if you have some of your data electronic, you want to check with your institution or the owner of the data. That's probably the best way to say it, regarding their policies and procedures for access to that data in that system by outside personnel, right? And then you want to be able to follow that process. I think it's always a good idea to, as you're preparing for the inspection, have information about not only your institution and department, but organizational charts and SOPs supporting the conduct of research. One of the questions that the inspector will ask in the beginning of her interview or his interview is, who is the head of MCW? If the inspection's happening at Freighter, who's the head of Freighter? But you kind of need to know that information. And hopefully you do have the correct information. And you want to be able to illustrate whether you have documentation of process regarding conduct of study, documentation of study, reporting of study, whatever the case may be. And then once again, just because I thought it needed to be listed twice, if that list of studies was requested, you're going to be bringing that forward for the inspector to review. So as you're continuing to prepare for the inspector coming on site, you want to make certain that minimally your PI and your lead research coordinator are available for the inspection. So the opening meeting, the daily debriefings, if it's going on for more than one day, because you've already asked about anticipated duration, right? And the closing meeting. So you want them to, whenever possible, start clearing that calendar, holding those spots open. You want to obviously include more people for your opening meeting that can speak to the conduct of the study, whatever their role or responsibility might be. So it could be if someone's primarily responsible for regulatory submissions, or someone from IDS and they're responsible for drug accountability and dispensing. You want to have them at the table, so to speak, to be able to talk about their role, their responsibility, and how, what their process is. And then I always encourage you, and so does the MCW policy, to have either Dr. Spellacy, Anne Marie Eve, or myself at the table representing the HRPP and IRB. So you're gonna start identifying who all needs to be at your table. You're going to send out meeting invitations to them so they also can clear their calendars and be available for those meetings. You also want to identify someone who's going to be the primary contact that's meeting with that inspector and kind of doing those check-ins. how are things going, anything you need, that kind of thing. You want to also have someone taking notes. Not only at the opening and closing meetings, but if there are daily debriefings, including notes about those activities. And if you have sufficient staffing, and I don't know how many teams really have sufficient staffing, you want another person who is going to be in charge of providing copies of documents that have been requested by the inspector. They're also going to make a copy for your team, and hopefully they're going to create a little log. Okay, I provided this, I provided that. And you have this nice little log to be able to refer to, as well as a copy of the documents, knowing what exactly that inspector is reviewing off-site. So that's all part of the preparation. Finally, the day has arrived and the inspector is here. So if this inspection is to take place within MCW property, and we know that property is all over the city of Milwaukee, and outside areas. Our policy says, first, that person needs to be escorted to security. Their identification, their credentials, their inspection for notice will be reviewed and verified there. And they'll be asked to sign in and be identified as a visitor. Not all inspections are happening in an MCW building. So I unfortunately do not know what the expectations are for each building that could host an FDA inspection. So I want you to check in with your compliance group, with your security folks. What is the process here? Always, you're going to meet them at the front door, wherever your front door is. And you're going to be escorting the inspector to their work area. Once you get that inspector to that space, the inspector is going to provide the 482. That's the notice of inspection. So at this point, all that you're going to be providing to the inspector is what's listed there. So if it's only documents pertaining to one study, that's all you're providing. If the inspector starts asking for another study, there's going to be additional documentation. Okay. The notice of inspection should be issued to the PI, the most responsible person for the conduct of that study. And then the PI will review it and sign it. And then as part of that opening, you're going to identify the individuals that are meeting for that opening meeting, identifying roles and responsibilities. Typically during that time, the inspector will start to interview many of the individuals of the research team regarding their conduct as it concerns the conduct of the study. You also want to make certain the inspector knows where the bathroom is and the cafeteria. Depending on the type of inspection, the inspector may ask to view other areas, maybe where investigational product is stored, or where lab samples are processed, or something else where participants are seen for the purpose of the study. And so you would just want to, escort them there. And I think it's always a good idea to check in with the inspector. Is it, if this inspection is going to go on for a number of days, is it possible to have a daily debriefing? And then if the inspector says yes, let's see if we can get the PI to attend that meeting. If not, you're going to want to be updating the PI with that information. Another thing that I like to remind people about is your FDA inspector has a heck of a lot of information and knowledge. And consider them as another opportunity for education. They have such, such great information. So sometimes it is helpful to ask a question, especially if they're asking for something. Sure, I can get that. Can you help me understand why? Whatever. So during the inspection, you want to be checking in periodically with the inspector. I would probably use the same sort of process that you use with your monitors when they come on site. You don't want to be harassing the inspector, but you don't want to leave them high and dry either. And as with any sort of interview, you want to be able to address questions honestly and clearly and concisely. And if you don't have the information, tell them, I don't have that piece of information, but I know where to go to get that information, or I can bring the person who has the information to you so that you can get the information. Sometimes you need to ask for clarification. Someone's asking a question, you're like, I don't know if you're asking about this or this. Get clarification before you render those answers. Once again, you're going to supply all the requested material. You don't want someone retrieving their own materials. And I have already talked about making the copies. If an issue comes up during the inspection, don't say, oh, I can fix it, and try to fix it right then and there. You want to keep a list of those issues. You're going to discuss them with your PI and the other members of your study team. And then you're going to be able to provide a response. Hopefully, if you're having a daily debriefing, you can do it right then and there. Otherwise, providing that response at the closing meeting, that final debriefing. As I mentioned, updates are fabulous for everyone. Not only for your PI, but your department chair, division chief might be very invested in this inspection. Hey, what's going on? Oh, it's okay so far. They're just going through this, that, and the other. Or, oh, they've identified a couple of issues and want to go further down that pathway. Good information. You also want to keep HRPP and the IRB informed. Okay, so I think it's a good practice to provide daily updates whenever possible. And then you just want to kind of check in with the inspector. Is that anticipated duration still pretty much what we can rely on? Or do you think you're going to cut the inspection short or need to extend it by another week? I've seen both. I have seen both happen. So it's always good to ask. I've been talking about a lot of things to do, right? Gathering documentation, what to do when you get a phone call, all of that. There are a couple of things you don't want to do. You don't want to be offering food or drink to these individuals. They're federal employees. They can't accept it. And you don't want to create any misperceptions about offering. You don't want to, excuse me, volunteer any additional information. Going back to understand what the question is, answer the question. Don't provide additional information. Restrain from discussing other studies with the inspector. Oh, you should see what they're doing over there on that study. Oh my God, if you want to pick that one, you'd be here for a month. You also don't want to denigrate your sponsor, your institution, members of the study team. This is not the time to be doing that. Other than that 482 notice of inspection, you shouldn't be signing any documents or affidavits at this time. And I went back and forth whether I needed to include this last bullet point. I would like to think it's not necessary to say, but my experience is it is necessary. Please try not to be defensive, evasive, confrontational. As I mentioned, the inspector came in for a reason, right? It's a routine audit or it's for cause. They're just doing their job. And so it's not going to help anyone if you decide to be confrontational or evasive. It usually just creates more questions, is my experience. So at the end of the inspection, you're gonna be able to identify that date and time for the closing meeting, and you're going to invite all those people who were at the opening meeting to the closing meeting. And at the closing meeting, the inspector will provide a summary of findings and will discuss those findings and what the subsequent activities might be expected. If there are significant findings, that inspector is going to kind of highlight those. He or she's going to speak about those first, right? And you know, they give you plenty of clues. So this was objectionable. These other things I just want to let you know about. They're gonna, once again, they're gonna be able to provide a written report for you. So in addition to identifying practices or conditions that were significant or objectionable, they're also going to be able to discuss whether any corrective actions are required or how to best address the issue. And so this is another great time for discussion with that inspector. If in your daily briefing, you learn that there are a couple findings, you and your team and your PI hopefully are starting to discuss that. And, oh, okay, so what do we want to do to correct it? Has it already been corrected? And the inspector just hasn't seen that yet. Well, you can let the inspector know about that. If it was corrected, but the documentation doesn't show it, well, then how are you going to make certain that documentation shows it? And what is that plan look like? How is that plan of corrective actions going to be implemented? What's the timeline? What's that retraining look like? All of that can be discussed. If there is a misunderstanding, if your PI believes that the inspector had a misunderstanding regarding the conduct or documentation or reporting of the study, you certainly can bring it up and you can say, yeah, I think maybe you didn't quite understand, this is what was going on. I have heard PIs say that. I will say that they weren't always reflecting that they had full understanding of the regulatory requirements when they made those statements. So I use caution with this, and I would encourage you all to use caution with it. I mean, if there truly is a misunderstanding, you want to get that corrected. But we always want to kind of check in, do we have the proper understanding of the regulatory requirements? So that's all happening in the closing meeting. This, as you can imagine, the Senior Associate Dean for Research needs to be notified. Hey, how did things end up? How did that closing meeting go? What was the outcome? You need to notify Dr. Nattinger within 24 hours. And so end of inspections, there can be a couple of outcomes. Things look pretty good. There was nothing objectionable that was noted in the inspection. Perhaps there were some things that were noted, but they don't rise to the level of requiring a written response and corrective action. And then you can imagine what the third one is. It's the objectionable findings were found and a written response is required. Typically in those situations, a 483 is being issued. If a 483 is issued, you also need to share that information, providing a copy to your department chair, division chief, HRPP director, and then in accordance with MCW policy, if MCW IRB is the IRB of record, making certain that the chair of the overseeing committee also receives a copy of that document. This is all within 3 business days. So as I was mentioning, the inspection outcomes, there basically are 3 buckets. The no action indicated, as I mentioned, nothing objectionable was found. You may not even receive a written summary or report when this is the situation. You might just get that oral. You can always ask, hey, will we get a report? And they'll say, well, not my decision. That's the center, that's the office. You know, definitely you can see where note taking would be very important there. The voluntary action indicated, you most likely will receive a written report there. The inspector will say, you know, you don't need to send in a written response regarding these findings. Many of our research teams do. That is seen as a very positive response by the FDA, but it's not required. And then the official action indicated there were those objectionable conditions or practices that were found, the scope or severity or the pattern of the violation supports findings either that participants were exposed to unreasonable or significant risk because of their participation in the study, or their safety, rights, or welfare had been seriously compromised, data integrity or reliability had been compromised. Any of those situations, you're going to hear an official action is indicated, you're gonna have a 483 issued. We just have a couple minutes left. Okay, I can go on forever, and thankfully, as I can, I'll show you here. So if a 483 is issued, certain things to remember here. You and your team have 15 days to submit your response to the center. So if it was a drug study that was being invested at CDER, if it was a study with biologic, it's going to that center. If you get my point. And the inspector will tell you which center you should be sending your response to. You're not sending the response to the inspector. If corrective actions have been requested, you hopefully are working with your team and your PI to identify corrective actions and get them implemented. And then prepare that written response. You can certainly request the assistance from the Office of Research in developing your response. So the Office of Research typically will then shift that over to HRPP, where Dr. Spellacy and Anne Marie, and some occasions I will be asked to weigh in on responses. We're not going to write it for you, but we will provide our feedback so that hopefully it's the best written response you can offer. So in your response, you're going to be, hopefully identifying what was the root cause for that problem or that issue, and what were the corrective actions that had been already put into place or will be put into place. And because the PI is ultimately responsible for the conduct of the study, how the PI is directly involved in these corrective actions and providing oversight to ensure that we're not having this reoccur. You want to be able to provide a copy of that final response to Dr. Nattinger at least 72 hours before your submission deadline. So you can see that your time frame for crafting your written response is starting to shrink, right? One thing that isn't on this slide is a reportable event also needs to be filed with the IRB. You can find information about that in the IRB's SOP for reportable events. Okay, so if a 483 is issued, you're filing a reportable event. If there was an inspection, so any FDA inspection, you're going to file a reportable event. If it was another type of inspection, everything was okay, not necessarily, but there are examples of when you should be filing a reportable event. Please refer to that SOP. So, lastly, you've heard it at least 5 times. The best advice I can offer you for preparing for an audit is you start preparing before you begin the study. Another piece of advice that I think is worthwhile considering is making certain that everyone on your team has a shared and common interpretation of the protocol, what is to be happening, how it's to be documented, and how it's to be reported. I have found in my experience of conducting routine reviews and audits that that's not always the case. Many people read the protocols. I know exactly what's expected of me, but they haven't checked in with their colleague to say, do you have that same impression? Please do that. And then, of course, utilize a system that is going to help you organize your documents and keep them sustainable and secure and readily accessible. MCW, clinical trials, you got Florence, you got Encore, use them. Why recreate the wheel if you don't need to? Last slide, hopefully before 1 o'clock, resources.
Right on the
Resources are always available. The IRB and HRPP were, give us a call, shoot us an email. We want to support you. We want to help you. The Office of Research is in the same position. We're here to support the compliant and ethical conduct of research.
Mhm.
Thank you all. If there are other questions, shoot me an email.
And we are right on time, but if anybody is still hanging on for a couple minutes and does have questions, we welcome you to unmute yourself or type it in the chat.
I had a question
Okay.
about financial disclosures. So I'm super used to if it's sponsor initiated, they're requesting those financial disclosures, they're providing them, my PI signs it, keep it on file. What if it's an investigator initiated study? Like I'm thinking of one that I have, it has DoD funding. So would that be like part of the contract already? Like, would that be built into that?
If it's DoD funded, yeah. I would not see that in the same bucket as a financial disclosure. So basically, a financial disclosure, the investigator is saying, whether or not they have significant interest in that company. Is there a good reason they want that device to get approved by the FDA or that vaccine to go to market? So that's part of the reason behind those financial disclosures. It's to have the information and better manage it. So for like federally funded, I think you can keep that award information separate.
It's like we're having devices supplied to us by a company, but that company is not sponsoring us.
Ah.
Do you think we need financial disclosures then? Saying that the PI doesn't want anything, doesn't want financial money from the company that's giving us these devices?
I think that's a great question, and I've not had that question before. So I would actually suggest that that question actually be shared with Kristen Bussey in the Office of Research, because she is a great source of information for sponsor investigator studies, those investigator initiated studies involving product.
Okay.
Also the IRB. And most likely, Kristen and the IRB will have several conversations and may include others before they're able to render a response for you.
Okay. Alright.
Good question.
Yeah. I was like, I don't know how I would handle that if I got FDA audited today, I don't know if I have financial disclosures.
Yeah,
Are they
no,
needed?
I think it's more those, those industry sponsored
Mhm.
type of clinical trials where we're gonna see the financial disclosures that are pertinent
Yeah,
for FDA inspection.
He doesn't own the company.
couple
that's supplying
questions.
the device, right?
no.
Okay.
Okay,
I've got a couple questions in the chat.
okay.
Ready for another one? The first one is, have FDA inspections changed since using Florence? Has anyone dealt with this yet?
There have, let's see, well, there's an FDA inspection that just concluded. I think Florence was involved. Florence should have been involved, but I have not heard to that detail. So if you have an FDA inspection and all your records are in Florence, I would connect with Jen Brown in the Office of Research, who I always think of as the Florence guru. And she'll be able to guide everyone's use of, accessibility of the system by the inspector. Hopefully, we are not having to print out all of that information. That would seem silly.
Yeah, and then the other example, maybe you just touched on this and I missed you, was that like, would the inspector have access to Florence?
I think, I would believe that the inspector would, it would be similar to what like a monitor has for viewing accessibility in Florence. But always, I'm not the primary person, in charge of Florence, so I would just confirm with Jen Brown.
There is another question.
Okay.
Are there any forms that FDA inspector puts in front of us that the coordinator will be signing, or will the PI be signing the forms and not the coordinator, or do they both sign?
I'm not aware of any forms that would be presented to a coordinator for signature. And I would hope that your PI or co-investigator, if the PI is not available, is receiving the notice of inspection and signing that.
I've never had to sign a form unless it was like a check-in form to document that I was at that meeting, but other people that were there too had to sign it, but no, it's not, here, sign this. And-
Right. Right, so that's a very good point. So for opening and closing meetings with the FDA, they will want a list of everyone who's in attendance at that meeting, and their role and responsibility. And so sometimes there's just one person writing everyone's name down because they're all on Zoom. And sometimes there are actually people in the room and they get to sign their own name, which is just so novel. Other questions?
Any other questions? Like it.
All righty, sounds good.
All right. Thanks for hanging around a couple minutes after 1. We do
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxanne. Very good.
Hope you all have a great
Thanks.
day.
If you want